was a bright afternoon in the heart of the city, and the park buzzed with life. Joggers passed by, children laughed as they chased each other, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted from a nearby cafe. Amid the lively scene, a golden retriever sat patiently on the grass near a bench. Its fur gleamed in the sunlight, and its eyes scanned the passing crowd with a calm, loyal gaze. This wasn't just any dog. It was Warren Buffett's companion, a quiet presence that mirrored his owner's unassuming nature. Warren sat a short distance away, at a table outside the cafe, dressed in his usual modest attire. A simple button-down shirt and a pair of neatly pressed slacks made him blend into the crowd, as he always preferred. He sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes scanning a newspaper, seemingly unaware of the bustling world around him. But nothing escaped his notice. He had placed his dog there intentionally, knowing the animal was calm and disciplined, never bothering anyone. As the minutes passed, a man approached from the far side of the park. He walked briskly, his phone pressed to his ear, his tone sharp and impatient. His expensive suit and flashy watch screamed arrogance, and his voice cut through the air as he berated someone on the other end of the line. "I don't have time for this nonsense," he snapped, shoving his phone into his pocket. He was in such a rush that he barely noticed the golden retriever lying peacefully in his path. The dog turned its head to look at him, wagging its tail slightly, but the man didn't slow down. Instead, he muttered angrily, "Stupid dog," before lifting his foot and giving it a sharp nudge with the tip of his shoe. The force wasn't enough to injure the dog, but it was cruel and unnecessary. The dog yelped softly, shifting away from him. The scene caught the attention of a few nearby people, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. A woman walking her own dog gasped audibly, muttering under her breath, "What kind of person kicks a dog?" The man didn't care. He brushed off the moment as if it hadn't happened, adjusting his suit jacket and walking toward the cafe. But before he could get far, he noticed a figure rise from a table nearby. Warren folded his newspaper calmly and walked toward the dog, his expression unreadable. He knelt beside the golden retriever, patting its head gently as he inspected it for any signs of harm. The man glanced back, his impatience clear. "Is that your dog?" he asked sharply, his tone implying that he felt inconvenienced by the question. Warren didn't answer right away. He stood slowly, his calm demeanor unshaken, and looked directly at the man. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady, "and I'd like to know why you felt the need to kick it." The man rolled his eyes, his arrogance on full display. "It was in the way," he said dismissively. "You should keep it on a leash if it's going to block the path." Warren's gaze didn't waver. The quiet strength in his eyes made the man shift uncomfortably, though he quickly masked it with another dismissive gesture. "Look," the man added, "it's just a dog. No need to make a big deal out of it." The tension in the air was palpable. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Warren remained silent for a moment, his expression calm, but firm. Finally he spoke, his words measured. "You're right. It is just a dog. But it's also a living being, one that trusts the people around it to treat it with kindness. The way you act towards something that can't fight back says a lot about who you are." The man opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of Warren's statement hung in the air, and the crowd watched, their curiosity growing. They didn't yet know who Warren Buffett was, but they could sense that this man was no ordinary dog owner. Little did the rude man realize, he was standing in the presence of someone who could change his life in an instant, and the revelation was just around the corner. The man chuckled nervously, brushing off Warren's words as if they were unimportant. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just a dog. Let's not blow this out of proportion." Warren didn't flinch. His calm, steady demeanor only heightened the tension. "It may be just a dog to you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But it's also a reflection of how you treat the world around you. If you think this moment isn't important, I suggest you take a closer look at yourself." By now, the small crowd had grown, and whispers rippled through the onlookers. The man shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance faltering under the weight of Warren's gaze. One of the bystanders, a young woman with a stroller, spoke up, her tone laced with disapproval. "He's right," she said. "You shouldn't treat an animal like that. What kind of person kicks a dog?" The man stumbled over his words, his confidence completely shattered. I didn't know," he stammered, his face pale. "I had no idea it was your dog." Warren tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "And if you had known?" he asked, his voice steady. "Would that have changed how you acted?" The question hit like a thunderclap, and the man froze, unable to respond. The crowd watched in silence, the tension in the air almost tangible. After a long moment, Warren sighed, his tone softening just slightly. "It's not about who owns the dog," he said. "It's about who you are when no one's watching." The man lowered his head, his shame evident. He mumbled an apology, though it was barely audible. Warren nodded once, then knelt to check on his dog, stroking its fur gently. The golden retriever wagged its tail, its trust in its owner unshaken, despite the incident. As Warren stood, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs carrying a mixture of admiration and awe. The rude man lingered for a moment, his head still bowed, before walking away, his arrogance replaced with quiet humility. Warren returned to his seat at the cafe, picking up his coffee and newspaper as if nothing had happened. But for everyone who had witnessed the incident, the lesson was clear. Respect isn't about status or recognition. It's about kindness, even in the smallest moments. As the rude man walked away, his steps slow and hesitant, the weight of Warren's words lingered in his mind. The once arrogant expression on his face had been replaced with something far more human: shame, regret, and perhaps a hint of self-reflection. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, though the incident was far from forgotten. Many murmured among themselves, some already typing up the event on their phones to share with friends or post online. Warren sat back at his table, stroking his dog's head as it rested peacefully beside him. He returned to his newspaper, though his mind remained on the interaction. He wasn't angry. Warren had long ago learned the futility of holding on to resentment. Instead, he hoped that the man had taken something meaningful from the moment. Change didn't come easily, but sometimes all it took was the right spark. A few minutes later, Clara, a young waitress from the cafe, hesitantly approached Warren's table with a fresh cup of coffee. "Excuse me, Mr. Buffett," she said softly, her cheeks slightly flushed. "I saw what happened earlier. I just wanted to say, the way you handled it was incredible." Warren looked up, offering her a kind smile. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone warm. "It's easy to react with anger, but it's harder, and more important, to respond with understanding." Clara nodded, her admiration evident. "Most people wouldn't have stayed so calm," she said, "especially after seeing their dog treated like that." Warren glanced down at the golden retriever, who was now wagging its tail gently. "This little guy teaches me a lot," he said, his voice tinged with affection, patience, loyalty, and how to forgive quickly. Clara smiled, But before she could respond, another figure entered the scene. It was the rude man, who had returned, his earlier bravado completely gone. He stood a few feet away, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets, his head slightly bowed. The crowd had mostly thinned out, but a few bystanders still watched curiously, sensing another chapter to the story unfolding. "Mr. Buffett," the man began, his voice hesitant. I wanted to apologize. I acted out of frustration, and there's no excuse for what I did. I was wrong." Warren looked up, his expression calm and unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, letting the man's words settle in the air. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured, but not unkind. "It's a good start to recognize when you've made a mistake," he said. "But the real work is in how you move forward." The man nodded quickly, his gaze still fixed on the ground. "I promise, I'll do better," he said. "Not just with animals, but with people too. I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. It's about who you are when no one's watching." Warren studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. The man looked up, startled, but quickly reached out to shake it. "We all have things to learn," Warren said. "The important thing is to keep learning." The man nodded again, gratitude evident in his eyes. He turned to the dog, kneeling down and gently extending a hand toward it. The golden retriever sniffed him cautiously, then wagged its tail, allowing the man to pat its head. The gesture, small as it was, seemed to lift a weight off the man's shoulders. As the man stood to leave, Warren's voice stopped him. "Kindness doesn't cost anything," he said, "but its value is immeasurable. Don't forget that." The man nodded once more, then walked away, his stride lighter than before. The bystanders who had remained began to clap softly, their admiration for Warren's grace and wisdom palpable. Clara, still standing nearby, wiped away a tear, her heart moved by the quiet power of what she had just witnessed. Warren returned to his seat, his dog curling up at his feet. The park resumed its usual rhythm, but for those who had seen the exchange, the day felt different. It wasn't just a story about a dog or a rude man. It was a reminder of the strength in humility, the power of kindness, and the lessons that could come from even the smallest moments. As the man walked away, his head slightly bowed, but his steps more deliberate, the crowd began to dissipate fully. Those who had witnessed the event carried the story with them, their admiration for Warren Buffett's quiet dignity and profound wisdom etched in their minds. For many, it wasn't just about the man or the dog. It was a lesson in how small acts of cruelty or kindness could ripple outward, affecting everyone around. Clara lingered by Warren's table for a moment longer, her eyes glancing down at the golden retriever. "You know, Mr. Buffett," she said softly, "I think the way you handled this will stick with him, and probably with a lot of us." Warren gave her a gentle smile, his hand still resting on the dog's head. "I hope so," he said. "Sometimes, the most lasting lessons aren't taught with anger, but with grace." She nodded, inspired by his words, before returning to her duties inside the cafe. Warren leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee and looking out over the park. The golden retriever stretched and lay back down, its tail wagging lazily, as if nothing had happened. Nearby, an older man who had observed the entire scene approached Warren. He tipped his hat slightly, his expression a mix of respect and gratitude. "I saw how you handled that fella," he said, his voice warm. "Not many would have had your patience. You're a good man." Mr. Buffett Warren nodded politely, his tone modest. "Thank you," he replied. "But I think we all have the capacity for kindness. Sometimes we just need a little reminder." The man smiled, tipping his hat again before walking off, leaving Warren to enjoy the quiet serenity of the park. The world around him resumed its usual rhythm. Children laughed, joggers passed by, and the sun continued to shine. But for those who had been there, the day felt a little different. For the rude man, the encounter stayed with him long after he left the park. Warren's words echoed in his mind, challenging him to reflect on his actions and the person he wanted to be. The lesson, simple yet profound, became a turning point, one he would carry with him as a reminder to treat others, even the smallest and most vulnerable, with respect. And as for Warren, he returned to his day as he always did, blending seamlessly into the world around him. He didn't need recognition or praise. The impact of his actions spoke for itself. The park grew quieter as the sun dipped lower in the sky, and Warren stood, his dog loyally at his side, ready to move on to wherever the day might take him next. But for everyone who had seen the events unfold, the memory of that moment, the calm wisdom of a man who could have responded with anger but chose grace instead, would remain a powerful story they'd tell for years to come.